Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to give you guys my Healer Balance 9-1 wish list. Start talking about what the problems are from 905 from a healer balance perspective, what's been going wrong about it, what's been kind of interesting, as well as some pie-in-the-sky dreams for what I think they could do, which would be super cool, but I don't think they will, and some more realistic, some more sobered ideas. As we get closer to 9-1, we're going to start getting that steady sort of slew of info to be coming around and find out what the meta is going to be looking like. So let's talk about the problem from the very beginning, okay? 9-0, we saw how double Paladin was just absolutely crazy dominant on almost every single fight that there was. We were seeing double Shaman coming in, seeing some plays, and a couple niche fights for like double disc. But those three healers just completely dominated the healer meta going into Castle Nathria. And 905 was pretty much like a double down. While our Druid and actually, I'd say our Druid, Holy Priest, and Mistweaver all kind of gained some ground and really seemed to step up in terms of their total output that they could bring to the table. That's pretty small potatoes when the other three dominant healers are doing comparable output and they bring all the utility, or they bring crazy passive damage, or in the case of Paladin, they bring both. So from a Paladin perspective, let's get it started from them. We've been looking at how, Hammer of Wrath, Shield of the Righteous, just Ashen Hollow, of course, have just made Paladin so crazy good. Devotion Aura at the start of the expansion got nerfed, so it's not as crazy strong, but it's still an insanely universal ability that never really seems to have any downsides. So let's talk about that for a bit. From the Devotion Aura perspective, why is it that there is one ability that's giving everybody damage reduction across the board to every type of mechanic? I mean, we've got AMZ, we've got Barrier, we've got Slink, we've got all these different things that are not universal at all. I mean, the thing it kind of reminds me of is just like a Warrior Shout, where you're raising everybody's health pool at the same time. But I think when you start having some of these damage reduction abilities, which are so crazy universal no matter what the encounter is, it's just ridiculous. And it's not even like, and Blizzard loves doing this as well, where they like, oh, this is how this ability worked for like 8 years until we changed it in like Legion or MoP or WoD or whatever, right? And then they go revert to that thing which we haven't experienced for 4, 5, 6 years, and everyone's like, what? But Devo's just like that, because Devo generally was not this ability which would keep you from taking that much damage. It was originally, if I remember, well, at least when I started playing back in my day, it was originally something that would just keep you from getting kicked, right? And we would use it on Thok the Bloodthirsty and cycle through Devotion Auras so that we wouldn't get interrupted and we could free cast, right? And I believe it was Warlords where it was like initially reducing the damage of physical damage, and then they tried to nerf Paladin leading up to Hellfire Citadel, and then they're like, hey, to compensate, we're gonna make Devotion Aura do physical and magic damage. And then they also reverted the nerf to Paladins there too. If I remember my history correctly, some OGs will probably let me know in the comments too. So it was like, at the end of the day, they just kept on like buffing it across the board, and like Devotion Aura isn't even this long-standing ability, Devotion Aura Mastery isn't even some like long-standing combination. So probably making that something where it's gonna be more radius bound to further kind of get it under control, I think would be a lot nicer. I don't think target capping would be a great idea. We've already seen how that's gone in a couple other areas, but definitely making it more of like an aura, more of a radius. Because we've seen like very good fights, very strong encounters for Barrier or Slink, but they still have more of a niche use to them. And I like that at the moment they're stronger than Devotion Aura because you're needing to be stacked for them and having that sort of requirement. But I think we're getting to this point right now where, especially when it's easier to re-roll and it's easier just to gear up and prep another character, you're just seeing such a like heavy flow of players going into these three specs and just leaving the others behind. Most notably Mistweaver, but we even saw some really big drops in like Resto Druid representation, for example. And it's just kind of ridiculous as well with how dominant for how long we've seen these three healers. So that's what I would say. Reduced radius or something like that for Devotion Aura is probably a little bit more realistic. From a damage perspective, I'd love it if they actually didn't do too much to Paladin's damage. Like maybe Ashen Hollow, of course. Get some nerfs, or Hammer of Wrath or Judgment or something like that. Could get a couple nerfs here and there. But by and large, I'd much rather have it where all the other healers just did more damage. Now, Obviously, Paladin should do the most damage of any of the healers because they do have wings. They have a primary healing cooldown they can turn into extra damage, right? But I really don't want to see Paladins just get like cut off at the knees and they get to do sucky damage like everybody else. Because like right now, I mean, yeah, there's the Resto Shaman Earth Elemental Legendary, which is great, which is really cool and really neat. But baseline damage for like all the other healers just feels terrible. Like I'll go in on my monk, there's Bloodlust rolling, I got all my haste procs and everything, and I'm like, yeah, I'm blasting. I can't even do 2k. Single target. I'm just like, kidding me, right? And it's just one of those things from like a healer perspective that you want to be able to contribute further in areas, especially, you know, if you're overhealing or especially at the beginning of a fight in a progression scenario. And it's like, well, I guess we just bring another Paladin because they're the ones who are actually bringing the heavy hitting damage to the table. I think more healers need to be integrated into that system. When we look at Disc Priest, you know, I benefited massively and my raid benefited massively from Spirit Shell shields, and it seems like we kind of have a regular cycle. It's like almost every other expansion at this point. Mist Pandaria, for example, Spirit Shell just became this crazy monstrosity. You know, we had that, we had Divine Aegis, just absorbs across the board. You go into Warlords of Draenor and they're like, hey, no more absorbs. And they kept trying all these different combinations of what they wanted to do with Disc back in WoD. And then it settled on like powered shield spam. So quite a fail for them there. And then they go back to the drawing board. They actually start getting throughput and just healing and burst healing back to the table for Legion. And then they say, oh, well, just keep on doing that for BFA. We'll just kind of stay the course. And it was kind of like an area of stagnation. And now we move on into Shadowlands that are saying, well, what if we just bring absorbs back? And it's just like, God, like we were like so close to just getting out of the woods, getting out of like these mass absorb events. And it's something that's like neat for a little while. And then you just see like how much it frustrates and annoys all the other healers around you. And it will just kind of continue into a cycle where it's like, well, it'll feel okay in like hardcore progression. There's actually damage for the other healers to heal. But then Disc inevitably just gets too powerful by the end of the tier, at the end of the patch, and then they're just shutting out all the fun for everybody else. You know, despite some of the nerfs that Spirit Shell's received in 905, Spirit Shell is still ridiculously strong, especially on things like Hungry Destroyer or Sire, where you can game mind games to like reverse the healing those bosses will try to do to themselves, and then you make even bigger shields. So I don't exactly know what they're going to be able to do with Spirit Shell in the middle of the expansion, because they're pretty allergic to making big sweeping changes mid-expansion. But it seems like we're kind of resigned to the fact that they're just going to steadily nerf Spirit Shell over time, and eventually they're going to have to nerf Atonement transfers too, or we're going to have some like weird situation where Atonement and Evangelism will just do a lot more throughput because they'll keep on nerfing the shields. We'll see what happens on that end, but specifically what I'd want to see with Disc would probably be just, again, lessening the effects of Barrier. It's kind of tough to say, oh, we'll just break Spirit Shell, or like just make Evangelism dominant again, which I wouldn't mind at all. But I do think that they're like really, really heavily kind of committed at this point. So if you have any ideas, give the video a thumbs up and just let me know what you guys think could be realistically kind of done to it, because their efforts to like try to break shields in the past, like Warlords of Draenor, kept on nerfing powered shield day in and day out, every single patch, and it was still brought to everything constantly across the table. When it comes to Shaman, you know, when we start looking at like the niche that each healer brings, Shaman's been kind of like the most surprising to me, because it's pretty much eroded its niche in its entirety by just like making Riptide super good, right? And what I mean by that is like Shaman, obviously it still wants to have people stacked, but it's nowhere near as dependent on it as we'd seen prior, right? Where we're just like, well, if people aren't nearby or people aren't stacked up or anything like that, you just do nothing, right? While this raid has been very favorable, of course, to Shamans for how easy it is to stack up for a lot of mechanics, no question. Even if we were getting into other fights like Il'gynoth or Mithrax, we've already been able to see how like just crazy good Riptide is on its own, coupled with like the Necrolord Covenant ability to just easily cleave no matter what's going on. And while that feels great, and it's really nice to see how Shaman has sort of grown into a greater and stronger M+ healer than they've ever been before, it also is like, well, this healer does as much healing as all the other pure throughput healers, or just about as much, and brings Mana Tide, and brings Slink, and doesn't have to channel the raid cooldown or anything like that. And you start kind of stacking all these things on top of each other, right? So that's also sort of that downside. So if they're going to be as universal, I don't think that they should just like destroy Riptide, right? Because that's a major piece of the puzzle for them from like an M+ environment, and again, makes it so they don't feel terrible on specific boss fights as well, which just have everybody spread out all over the place. So I think from like more of a realistic perspective, and again, like I said, not all knowing, I'd love to be able to hear what you guys think as well going into this one. But I'd really like to start seeing if the punishment of sorts is like breaking down the utility, right? Lowering some of the refresh rate of like Spirit Link, so it's not just always balancing everybody's health pool at such a massive rate. Like being able to sit in Spirit Link the entire time and have everybody's health redirected, so everybody ticks down together as the boss is already slammed into the wall, for example, is just like crazy insane, right? I don't know if that's something that would realistically happen, but like I said, something like that. And I don't think that Mana Tide is like crazy insane of like a utility cooldown, but that's another area where, hey, it brings this thing for free, whereas Holy Priest symbol desperately needs to just give flat mana back instead of just having it based off of people's missing mana, because then it just becomes such a like minor cooldown in the face of Mana Tide, which, hey, you could drop forever and you can always be getting regen for everybody as long as they're going to be nearby, right? So if they're going to have more of an erosion of some of these different niches for different specs, which again I'm not a huge fan of, but I understand the benefits, especially for shamans who've been waiting for their day to come in an M+ environment. We've sort of had this experiment in Uldir where paladins and shamans just did really crappy healing and just were really struggling in Uldir as people were just kind of figuring things out at the beginning of the expansion. And it almost felt like they were taxing the utility and saying, oh, because you guys bring utility, you're going to do a heck of a lot less healing. And then, of course, buffs start coming around for it. You see Glimmer start coming around and getting integrated for Paladin and Battle for Azeroth and everything, and those classes start shooting up later on over time, right? But I think that from the very beginning of that sort of experiment, they were like, oh shit, well this just feels terrible, because even if you start lumping on damage reduction or the utility value or whatever onto a healing meter, it's still going to feel bad when you're just not doing any sort of healing or not doing any sort of healing relative to your peers, right? So eroding or bringing down some of the utility value and maybe bringing up some of the healer value that, you know, like Holy Priest is bringing by being able to increase the value of Symbol of Hope is nice. The Divine Hymn buff was nice, for example. I'd love to see them try to do something like that for Tranquility on top of it. And when looking at Monk, we've been looking at how Fist Weaving has just kind of grown and further developed and kind of blossomed in many respects to being, you know, a very viable, very powerful playstyle. But it also has the downside of, well, you're stuck in melee and you're not a paladin and you're not dealing that much damage. So again, further increasing the amount of damage that Monk is going to be able to bring to the table and making the actual damage to healing conversions that they're doing through something like Ancient Teachings of the Monastery a more dominant amount of their output, rather than, you know, passive hots or refreshing Jade Wind or something like that. Have more of it come from something like Ancient Teachings, and probably just add more sort of control to it as well, so you can more easily direct it, because otherwise you're just kind of spewing healing all over the place at random targets constantly, right? For a while, I mean, Cocoon has just been this weak buff that'll give your tanks maybe a little bit of breathing space, but the reason for not having that as an actual defensive, an actual external, is really frustrating. I do like where Guardian Spirit is at, not gonna lie, especially when it just kind of grants you that cheat death, but only having a pure absorb, I don't think really goes far enough for a lot of tanks, and that needs to be heavily addressed. With the revival, I mean, we can kind of go from like a pie in the sky, like, hey, give everybody a buff that like staggers them or something like that, which would be great, or very cool to help like reduce the damage they take for a little bit, or have something like Ray of Hope from PvP, where it's going to like stop everybody's damage and then rebalance it based on the healing they receive. Those kind of things would be hilarious, but unrealistic, right? And I think that it's very frustrating to try to like think of minor changes that they could make at the exact same time. I'd love to see something where Revival gave like versatility, or very, very slight mastery buff or something like that. I feel like versatility would be great because we're already having like Divine Hymn increase all the healing that people are receiving. Add something similar to Trank or make it so you can move and Trank at the same time, and then look at something like versatility for revival so that there's always some kind of like extra value that gets added to the table, right? They've been really liking a lot of these fights like Council or even like Sire, where there is that big burst of damage that's going to come out, followed by a lot of ticking damage, you know? So, hey, if you're going to be able to further reduce the damage that people are taking after the fact, and the fights are relevant for that, then that'd be pretty cool. If it's only going to be a one burst and then there's complete downtime, like something like Zakul, then yeah, it's going to feel pretty crappy, right? But I'd love to hear what you guys think, as healer balance has just kind of been this revolving door of, well, these three classes are going to be on top. Oh, maybe we bring two this tier, or oh, maybe, you know, even though you bring all three of them, Pally feels a little bit better or something. But at the end of the day, I think that it's left a lot of people in the community, especially with how like hyper meta focused we all are with, you know, YouTube content, with Race to World First, High End M+, everybody kind of has their eyes on, well, I should just play the best, you know, I should play this thing because everybody's been playing it, right? And from my experience, both playing the meta and playing the off meta, you know, it's frustrating because there is a lot of potential in these classes, but I think, you know, the more that I think about it and the more of this video, I think I kind of just lay out, hey, this would be really cool if they did it, but they probably won't because it's too extreme, right? It kind of lays out how I think light-handed that they can be in terms of development, and how that frustrates people and leaves them very feeling as if their class and their position with their class that they might really love is just stagnant, right? Part of that's, sure, community perception, but I think there are a lot of times good reasons around it, you know? Mistweaver, I've been having a crazy amount of fun on, but I know that it's not something that I would bring to my Mythic progression team. And that feels pretty bad, right? Of course, I've got a lot of love for Priest, no question, but it's when you play something and you're like, well, this is really fun, and I like playing it, but I'm only playing it on farm. Pretty unfortunate. Let me know what you guys think. Be sure to leave a comment down below, and be sure to check out the live stream as well, as we're going to have tons and tons of PTR testing coming up very, very soon, guys. So have a great night. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch y'all next time.